China stands ready to work with all the other BRICS parties to support the work of the New Development Bank.
From the BRICS New Development Bank to the threat of terrorism, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa addressed global issues at their annual summit in India. Hello, I'm Nathan King, in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Amid a sluggish global economy and growing threat of terrorism, BRICS leaders meet to discuss how they tackle the challenges they face. CCTV's Shweta Bajaj attended the summit in Goa in India and has this report.
The leaders of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, concluded their summit with agreements on key issues of regional and global importance. BRICS has played an active role in shaping the agenda for change and development. This time, the leaders focused on counter-terrorism, sustainable development, people-to-people ties, and creating new ways to work with traditional financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The leaders decided the process of institution building in BRICS must continue to remain the focus. A major step was to fast-track the formation of a BRICS credit rating agency to assist emerging economies. The BRICS countries have already set up the New Development Bank, which became operational last year to meet funding requirements of the members. The countries also decided to establish an agriculture research center, railway research network and sports council. BRICS nations also agreed to increase trade and investment among the members. In 2015, intra-BRICS trade stood at about $250 billion. A target has been set to double the number to $500 billion by 2020. BRICS nations also pushed to increase cooperation at multilateral forums like the G20 and WTO. Chinese President Xi Jinping said, even though the treacherous recovery of the global economy has affected growth among the BRICS countries, the potential of the five-nation group continues to be unchanged. He added that innovation holds the key to leapfrog development and urged businesses to follow this path for sustainable economic development. Shweta Bajaj, CCTV, Goa, India.
Joining me now to discuss the role China and India play in the BRICS is Yun Sun, a senior associate of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, and Gautam Adhikari is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, focusing on India foreign relations. Gautam, let's start with you, because obviously India hosting this BRICS summit in Goa. A difficult time for the BRICS nations because of the slowing global economy and also the competing interests of this bloc as well.
Yes, indeed. But at the same time, it must be pointed out that the Indian economy is doing rather well right now compared to several years past. It's actually the fastest growing economy in the world amongst the major economies. And China has, of course, slowed down, but Bangladesh is doing pretty well. And, you know, I mean, generally in South Asia, the economic outlook is not that bad. But that apart, yes, there are tensions within the BRICS political economies, if I can call it that. And obviously, those cannot be underplayed.
Let's go to you. China very much obviously trying to make sure that BRICS is still relevant in the fact that we have this slowdown. Was there enough momentum, do you think, created in Goa to push the BRICS agenda forward?
I think from China's perspective, China certainly would like to have a collective voice among the emerging markets or among the leading developing countries. So there is a debate as well whether China should play a leading role or a guiding role among the BRICS countries. And like you pointed out, there are conflicting agendas, there are different interests, but it doesn't mean that as a collective voice, BRICS has already lost its momentum.
And there is momentum there, isn't it? We've seen the New Development Bank obviously set up in rapid time, in 3 years, based in Shanghai, headed by an Indian, so this is interesting, making loans. But there were other things decided as well, credit rating agency for developing countries, so there is sort of movement on the infrastructure.
There are a lot of movements on the infrastructure development front. There are also, like you pointed out, there is some momentum to calling for more financial capitals to be available to the developing countries, especially for the BRICS countries. There are statements about climate change. There are statements about trade facilitation, about enhanced economic cooperation among the BRICS countries. So there are quite a variety of content coming out of Goa.
Yes, it's a broad agenda. Let's just have a listen to Chinese President Xi Jinping about the agenda of the BRICS.
We have to confront complicated geopolitical factors intertwined with traditional and non-traditional security risks, and also rising global challenges such as terrorism, infectious diseases, and climate change.
Gautam, picking up off that, there has been some suggestion that China, as we just heard from Yun-Sun, and India and Russia are mainly in the driving seat when it comes to this cooperation, and Brazil is slightly taking a back seat along with South Africa. I've heard that not BRICS, but RIC. Is that something that you see in this grouping coming apart a little bit, or do you think there's more cohesion?
I think BRICS is a far more fluid and dynamic concept right now compared to what it was earlier, and I do think that China and India, I'm not so sure about Russia because Russia's interests are less perhaps in the developing world and the Asian scene rather than the West, and its tensions with the United States and its tensions with Europe. Those are separate things that drive the Russian agenda. I don't think Russia is, it might be keen on a strong voice in BRICS, but BRICS itself is relatively weak. And speaking of climate change that you were talking about, China and India have both signed on to the climate accord. And that is done, regardless of BRICS or any kind of united voice in BRICS. I mean, that's China and India working together. I mean, these two countries in 10 years' time will be 40% of the world's population, and probably growing in proportion. I'm not sure about that, but still. But they will also be two of the largest economies. China is already, in purchasing power terms, the largest economy in the world. And India is growing rapidly. And so what China and India do together, I think, is perhaps more important, and maybe in the G20 and forums like that, rather than what happens exactly in BRICS nowadays.
I'm glad you brought up the China-India thing because Prime Minister Modi actually set a marker down and said BRICS trade is about 250 billion a year now, wants to get it to 500 billion by in the not-too-distant future, 2020. Do you think that's achievable?
I think it's...
Considering we're seeing actually a decrease in global trade now.
Right, but not decrease as far as India goes, and China, China is poorly performing at 7%, which is a different way of putting it, actually. And China might recover, and then I think China and India, by and large, will be the driving factors within the BRICS countries. The Russian economy depends a lot on certain external issues like oil prices. So right now, oil prices are improving, so Russian economy will be a little better, but it's not in that great a shape. Brazil is having its own problems. So, and South Africa is not in that great a shape either. But China and India, I think, have forged ahead in different ways. And there is a lot of Chinese investment within India. Chinese companies are expected to invest about $20 billion worth. Now that's, I think, a big deal. And I think that economic bilateral relationship with China and India are already they're the biggest economic partners as far as trade goes. I think China has overtaken the United States as India's largest trading partner right now. So I think those are factors that have to be taken into account, and those will count for a lot.
Yun-Sun, Jim O'Neill, who was the economist who came up with the term BRICS, has actually said he's more positive about the BRICS than he's ever been, largely because of China's input. What do you think he means by that, and why is China's input so important at the moment?
I thought it was because he came up with the term.
So he wants to keep it going.
Yeah.
He wanted to keep it going. Well, we know that China is faced with its own economic slowdown problem at home, but it doesn't mean that China has been less ambitious coming to its foreign economic cooperation. In fact, there is the argument that now China is looking at foreign markets to stimulate its domestic growth. And when we look at campaigns like the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of that is associated with China's domestic growth. For example, using infrastructure development to stimulate the absorption of China's overcapacity. Of course, there are certain controversies associated with that outside China as well, like India wondering whether, or India and some African countries wondering whether China will be dumping its overcapacity in their market. So those are issues that need to be worked out. But for China, this going abroad, this foreign economic cooperation is pretty much seen as a future of China's economic growth. So I definitely think there is a lot of momentum from Beijing, from the central government, to use Chinese financing, to use Chinese capacity, and use the Chinese manpower to stimulate this growth.
And in terms of foreign policy, particularly with the members of the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, how does that affect China's foreign policy goals?
In terms of China's foreign policy, to have a collective voice among developing countries, especially among the leading developing countries, has always been a key component to China's foreign policy. Because when China looks at the world, they see that there's established discourse by the Western countries, and China, as a newcomer, did not necessarily participate in all the rulemaking. So when China tries to find its partners in international affairs, these emerging markets or developing countries are identified as China's natural partners.
So are these economies the can-do economies of the G77, the 132 member grouping that China's been so part of, or a more workable G20 when it comes to sort of developing countries?
Coming to developing countries, China definitely has different platforms. If you look at Africa, there's a FOCAC forum. If you look at the leading countries, there's BRICS, and then there's G20, there's G77. But for China, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. So all these platforms play their distinct role in China's foreign policy. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Cooperation, but also competition, especially between India and China. Before the BRICS summit, we saw President Xi Jinping in Bangladesh. We also are seeing a more tightening of the relationship between Pakistan and China as well, and a closeness of the US and China as well. How's that playing into the BRICS dynamic?
Well, I personally think that as far as the BRICS dynamic goes, this concept of a collective voice should be separated from the concept of BRICS, which is more of an economic concept than a political platform, really. Whereas the collective voice that China might want in its foreign policy with the developing countries is China's approach, but it is, as you said, there's competition and there's cooperation. I mean, in Africa, for instance, China and India are in severe competition over influence, both economic and therefore de facto political. They are competing in Latin America. Now, China's ahead of the game, but India is catching up as far as Africa goes. So there are competing interests. Then China's interests in South Asia are not necessarily the same as India's in all respects. China's relationship with Pakistan is a sore point. As far as India keeps very wary, a watchful eye over that relationship, because China has both economic as well as political interests in keeping the Pakistan relationship going. Pakistan doesn't have too many close friends in the world right now, but China is certainly perhaps its closest major international friend. So these are competing issues that are there within the BRICS countries that have to be taken into account. I think 3 international relationships are going to be worth watching over the next 10 years or so. One is, of course, the US-China relationship. I think it's the most important one in the world right now. The second would be the Russia-NATO-US relationship, which also is getting more and more complicated over things happening in the Middle East and other issues.
Yes, of course.
And finally, the India-China relationship, for some of the reasons that I cited earlier, that they would be about 40% of the world's population and 2 of the perhaps 3 major economies in the world. And therefore, that counts for a lot.
Yunsun, your views on the India China relationship in the context of BRICS and beyond?
In the context of BRICS, well, at least from China's perspective, this is a collective voice among developing countries. So China and India definitely have a lot of common interest. They have a converging interest in having that collective voice and to have their common voice in the international affairs. But I also agree with the view that between China and India, there are certainly a lot of issues of contention. When we talked about the China's investment plan, infrastructure investment in India, or in South Asia for that matter, there are pushbacks from India because India is concerned about the growing or expanding Chinese influence in the region or in their own country. And what does that mean? Does that translate into political influence in India's domestic affairs? Because there are a lot of such concerns. And Pakistan is definitely one of the issues, like the mentioning of counterterrorism in the BRICS announcement, in the BRICS statement this time. We know that India pushed pretty hard to include Pakistan in the statement, but China pushed back. And in the end, I'm sure the statement was a product of compromise. But it also just illustrates that there is a level of strategic distrust between China and India. But this is primarily remained in the political field. So we hope that BRICS as an economic platform would be less of a contention on these issues.
Fascinating, Yun-Sun. Thank you so much. Also, Gautam Adhikari for joining us as well. Coming up, we take a closer look at two other BRICS economies, Brazil and South Africa. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're taking a look at the recent BRICS summit. Joining us now for more on the BRICS summit is Monica Ohuda. She teaches at the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. And via Skype from London, Io Johnson is the founder and director of Viewpoint Africa. Thanks both for joining us. Monica, let's start with you. Brazil, key member of BRICS, but has been going through a tough time economically, one of the worst recessions in the nation's history. How's that affected the BRICS and Brazil's participation in it?
You know, it's a matter of Temer, the new president, reassuring himself, showing himself as the new leader of the country, right? Because he had a very disputed impeachment process, and there are a lot of people in the country that still challenges his presidency. And I think for him, for his government, it was a show of credibility, a show that he's there meaning business, and that he's there to stay, at least to finish Dilma's presidential term.
But there's lots of economic differences between the two, correct?
Yeah, you know, and fortunately so, because the way that the 6 years in which Dilma stayed in power, you saw a tremendous retrocess in terms of economic performance. All the good accomplishments that you actually had during the Lula administration, which is the PT government, they were being deteriorating during his administration, and she didn't really seem to have acknowledged that was a problem with her government and not something else that was global, as they were claiming that to be.
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about that, and 2008, of course, saw the global crisis, and BRICS has really been an institution that's had to weather that more than some. Io, let's go to you. South Africa, the only African nation in the BRICS grouping. It too's had a few economic woes, especially with threats from the credit agencies and stuff like that. Is the BRICS grouping okay for a downturn as well as when there's rapid growth?
You must take the good with the poor and the rough with the smooth. I'm afraid South Africa has gone through a very, very troubling time in the past few years. The economy has slowed down. Besides, it's been growing slowly, but it's going through a difficult time. Fiscal policy is not working too well. Zuma facing a lot of problems politically. The accusation of corruption still surrounds some of those concerns by the populists, and of course we only saw recently many people are saying that South Africa is still a huge magnet for jobs around Africa itself. and they are clearly a huge draw representing Africa on this massive stage. But not to say that South Africa clearly has many issues, but ultimately, I think it's looking at the bigger picture, how we can generate more jobs for its populace, how we can maintain that fiscal policies are at their best, and ultimately how we can continue to grow the economy. Growth is clearly paramount for Zuma right now.
Just staying with you, how does South Africa's involvement in BRICS affect the continent of Africa as a whole? Is there an engine of development through South Africa's membership?
Well, there is always going to be an engine. In fact, they've just signed a huge $1 billion agreement with China on the automotive industry. But I think key for South Africa right now, it's how does it create jobs? How does it move forward in terms of policy? But ultimately, how does it carry the rest of Africa with it? Because it's true, when South Africa sneezes, the rest of Africa catches a cold. So what happens to South Africa trickles down throughout the entire continent. But yes, South Africa needs to be able to do a lot of bilateral agreements, which it's currently doing with other BRIC members, but ultimately it's about trade.
Monica, I want to go back to you. South Africa suffered from a slowdown in commodity prices, Brazil too as well. There's even been some suggestions that Brazil and South Africa don't really belong to this BRICS grouping, that it should be more like RICS, Russia, India and China, or IC, India and China. What's your response to that?
I mean, I don't agree with that clearly, right? Because if you look at the, despite of all problems that Brazil has, its GDP is pretty big, like over $2 trillion, almost $2 trillion. So it's not insignificant, and it just, Brazil is going through a bad phase. And the nice thing about this government and nice thing about the economies, the mainstream economies in Brazil, is that they know how to get out of this mess, right? In the past, when I was still living in Brazil, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you have that level of financial crisis and the mismanagement of the state machine, people didn't know how to deal with inflation, right? So now there's a consensus. They know exactly what to do. Well, and it's just a matter of time that they're going to put things on track.
Well, my follow-up to that would be, what can the other BRICS members do to help the Brazilian recovery?
I don't think that they really can do much, right? It's just more a self-created problem that Brazil finds himself, and now they need to get them out of this mess, right? I mean, it's good that they have this forum for exchange of ideas, of promoting trade within among themselves. So it's always helpful to have that Brazil diverges itself a little bit from Mercosur and moves and try to look for other partners. So that in that respect is helpful. But I think it's up to Brazilian people and the Brazilian government to find to get out of the deeper well that they are now.
In terms of this grouping, it was first coined by an economist, Jim O'Neill, and it does seem, when you look at it geographically, very dispersed. But there are values in terms of the global South and wanting to have a different international economic architecture. Do you see that being achieved in this time of economic uncertainty, especially when it comes to South Africa and the rest of the continent?
Well, that's just the word, uncertainty. The global slowdown doesn't help. Uncertainty with economies worldwide, which South Africa would need to trade with, including all the BRIC nations. That's a major problem. But I think what's key here is the new development bank, which has been set up by the group. And of course, in its ability to be able to lend and trade freely and easily. That would help significantly. And also the fact that they're willing to set up a new mechanism for its own ratings, moving away from the traditional ratings which have affected South Africa in terms of its fiscal policy, but coming up with a new set of rules of setting up that would apply specifically to BRIC countries. I think that would help them significantly, especially on the bond market. So I think South Africa is gearing up for the long term. It understands the challenges facing the world today in terms of a slowdown. It knows it needs to be able to trade and build up on that trade with Africa and the rest of the world, but more so among its fellow BRIC countries of Brazil, India, China, and Russia. But ultimately, I think South Africa is clearly keen to be able to work closely with all those individuals to be able to make sure it works.
I'm glad you mentioned the credit rating agency, because this is really key for a lot of developing countries, especially South Africa. A little bit of a history. South Africa has had some real problems with the big US credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, Moody's. There's been a lot of domestic press about how they're unfair to developing countries. Do you think a credit rating agency based amongst the BRICS countries could do better? And also, will it be recognized by the global financial system that recognizes these big three American institutions?
Well, why not? Because they're a massive block onto their own. And if they're coming with a new agency which would say, well, fair enough, our debt, because every country's got debts, and of course the BRICS nations have their debt. If those debts can now be made available in the bond market for other people to buy that debt and then recycle that back in, then that's a huge opportunity, because some of these other agencies haven't really, they've downgraded the South African economy, which hasn't helped. It's affected confidence with investors. And I think if South Africa, Brazil, India, China, and Russia can come up with their own and say, well, even if others don't buy into our stake, even if others don't relate to what we're doing, even if they don't have the confidence, we're saying we've got a rating which says otherwise.
Monica, last word on, I'd like you to pick up on the rating agency, but also the new development bank, because of course that's big on infrastructure loans, along with other institutions, which of course Brazil has utilised in the past.
Yeah, first on the credit ratings, I think that more competition is always good, because you have a lot of power on these three major agencies. Yeah, exactly. But just you have three agencies that really, and they have had their problems in the past, not only assessing countries, but assessing companies as well.
The housing crisis here,
Enron is one case. But I'm a bit skeptical about having one credit agency being created by these countries. I would prefer to be a more neutral party. Because in the end, investors are going to be concerned about saving their money, securing their money, and they want to have returns on their money, and so they can come up with any credit agencies they want. But if they're not credible, right, you're not going to have, investors are not going to use it.
Point taken on the new development bank and infrastructure loans between.
I think it can be helpful, especially for South Africa. But I know that China is investing. Aside from the development bank, they have their own investment policy in Latin America, and Brazil has benefited a lot. And in the last wave of investments they have made in Latin America, the focus has shifted a lot to building infrastructure. But I can see I think the bank can be very helpful, because they have so many projects on environmental policies and agribusiness, and I think that would be a good medium through which channelize all that money that they have. It's a wealthy group, right? So they don't need to go use another banks, IMF or the World Bank, for that matter, if they can have greater control of their investment.
So BRICS continue to move forward despite the economic headwinds it's facing. Monica Ahuda, thank you so much here in our Washington DC studio, and Io Johnson in London. Thanks very much for a very stimulating discussion. That's all we have time for, but the conversation does continue online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CCTV_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington DC, and thanks so much for being with us.